Welcome Home, a podcast for veterans, about veterans by veterans, is a project of Willing Warriors and the Warrior Retreat at Bull Run.
Good morning. I'm Larry Ziliak, your host, Director of Culinary Services here at the Warrior Retreat at Bull Run. And today our guest is Dave Merlino. Am I saying that right, Dave?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. And he, along with his partner, Dustin Sweet, are the writers, directors of a wonderful documentary called Apache Blues, Welcome Home. This was a story about the 1st Squadron and the 9th Cavalry Regiment, which was the first air assault unit in Vietnam. I haven't seen the documentary, but I've watched the trailer twice, and it's pretty obvious that these guys were put through the grinder. And it's a great film, and I'm just so anxious to learn more about it. So welcome to the podcast, Dave.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
So if you would, just tell our listeners a little bit about your background, your partner's background, and the documentary, and really we'll get into how it started and what it's all about. But just give us a little bit about your background.
Okay. Dustin and I actually met a few years ago, I'll say, in college. I was going to Seattle University, and Dustin went to the Art Institute of Seattle. His background is a computer animator, and they lived in our residence halls at Seattle U. So we met way back then and always said we were going to make movies together. Then life kind of got in the way. I went on to a career in law enforcement with U.S. and Customs and Border Protection, and Dustin went on to be an animator. And finally, after working for the government for only as long as I could handle, I just called him and said, "Hey, if we're going to do this, we're going to do this. Like, let's actually make the movies we said we were going to make." And that's kind of how it started. You know, you just kind of got to make the move.
Yeah, sure. How did you land on this project? Was this your first project, or I know you have other documentaries out there, but how did you land on this?
It is our first feature film. We started out writing screenplays, and then said, "Okay, let's try directing," and we made some short films to varying degrees of competency as we got better going along.
Sure.
And our last short film, Happy Birthday, Dad, which I had written after my father had died, just about the strength of, what you learn from your fathers and pass on. Now Dustin and I are both fathers. We each have daughters, and what we pass on to them. That film went on the festival circuit, and everyone was telling us, your next movie has to be a feature. You're done making short films. It has to be a feature. And we had cast a friend of mine from Customs, Craig Jorgensen. He had been our writing mentor. He's the one who said the difference between saying you're going to be a writer and being a writer is actually sitting down and writing. And he walked us through our first screenplay. And so we kind of would cast him in short films as a thank you. And at the end of our run, we got into 2 festivals that happened at the exact same time, one in Santa Fe and one in Eastern Washington. I live in Washington. Dustin lives in New Mexico. So Dustin said, "I'll go to Santa Fe, and why don't you take Craig to the one in Eastern Washington?" And at that time, I was living in Seattle. I now have moved to Spokane. But we drove over from Seattle, and Craig is a Vietnam veteran, and it was like an hour and a half drive, and he was just telling stories from Vietnam. And I'd heard them all before, but for some reason that day I could just see the cinematic scope of the stories that he was telling. And by the time we got home from the festival, I called Dustin and I said, I know what our next feature is, and it's going to be about Craig and his friends. We had thought maybe a scripted story, but we met a producer and said, "No, this is a documentary. Like, you need to tell these guys stories." And being people who, we started as screenwriters, and we're like, well, this documentaries don't even have a script. We don't know what to do. But we talked to our directing mentor that night. We're down in LA, and he had Darren Scott. He has a kind of a drop-in at a bar for all the industry professionals he knows. You can just drop in and kind of hang out. So we went to see him, and we were talking, and we told him the idea, and he was kind of stirring his drink, and he just stopped and he looked at us and he said, "Well, I have one question. Are you guys stupid?" I'm like, I don't know, maybe. Like, jury's out if you ask our wives. He said, "Because you guys are stupid if you don't do this movie." And that was the straight talk we needed.
Yeah. So now you decide to move forward with the project. I'm guessing that there was a lot of footage available from their time in Vietnam because they were the first air cav unit. Did that help out with the production and sort of giving you that visual background for when you interviewed each of these veterans? It
did. A lot of these guys had their photo albums, a lot of Polaroids and photo albums that have been sitting in there for 50 years. So we couldn't really take them out and scan them. So we would sit at everyone's house with our cell phone, taking individual pictures of each Polaroid in the album, and then use a cropping program to get them camera ready. But we did luck out. We've met some veterans along the way who, like a pilot who took video of like his time in the cockpit and just time on base, and he gave us all his footage, which was amazing to have that type of footage. And also we were lucky that there was a day that a news agency was embedded with our guys, and Craig was actually shot on camera in front, and it goes right through the airlift of Craig out of there. And so to have that type of footage where it's not just we're talking about Vietnam and showing some archival stock footage, but actually these are the guys in that footage who are talking about their story. It was an incredibly powerful thing.
So you decide that the format is going to be documentary and that you're going to interview the veterans that were part of the unit. How many did you interview?
We interviewed 11 veterans from the unit, and then also some, we call them the experts. Like we talked to a gentleman, Dr. Roy Clymer, who was the head of specialized care at Walter Reed, also a Vietnam veteran, just talking about the effects of commonly referred to as PTSD, but it's more commonly referred to now as PTS because it's not a disorder to be affected by really horrible things. And we talked to the National Vietnam War Museum and the veterans there, and also to Randall Wallace, who directed We Were Soldiers. And that, because our first thought on making this movie is for Dustin and I, having been born after the war, a lot of our view of the war was kind of talked to us through a political lens, whether it be in school or what you see in pop culture. It's really hard for a lot of people to resist the lens of the politics around the war, which is a fair lens. There was a lot of politics, but that's not the soldier story.
Right.
And so for us, talking to people like Craig and everyone in his unit, we hear the same stories of heroism that you hear from World War II, from Korea, from modern day wars, but they'd never really been afforded the opportunity to tell that. And so we just wanted to go talk to the soldiers and get it, straight from the source and learn more about the war without having to learn about the protests and everything else.
Sure.
That was our original idea. And so we talked to Randy about, Randall Wallace, about how he felt as a director making a movie that many veterans considered a very fair depiction of the war, how he kind of avoided what are the responsibilities of filmmakers when telling a story like this. When you make a documentary, if you end up with the movie when you're all done editing it and you end up with the movie you thought you were making at the very beginning, you didn't really make a documentary. You made an opinion piece. You went out and you found exactly what you thought you wanted to hear and you put that all together. Mm-hmm. You have to allow yourself to find the true story while making it. And as we were making the movie, when we would talk to the veterans, and some of them had never talked in 50 years, the first time they were telling their story was with us with a camera and literally in their face, like 3 feet away from them. Mm-hmm. And as soon as we turned off the camera, you could just see them relax and just say, wow, that was really, I really want to thank you. That felt really good to be able to talk. Mm-hmm. And so through talking to the veterans and seeing that reaction and talking to Dr. Clymer about what PTS is and how it affects not only veterans, but society, what we think PTS affects our view of them compared to what it actually is, we realized that the story wasn't us being able to hear the story. It was the veterans being able to tell their story and the therapeutic effect just being able to talk had on them. Right. And so we also realized, though, that it's very easy at the time to say, oh, I feel great. I'm going to go talk to my daughter. I'm going to talk to my wife. Does that hold? Like when you get home the next day, did that happen? And so we decided to shut down production for a year and follow up with them a year later. And the differences were remarkable in some cases, actually. And then it became, we use Vietnam as the driver of the story, but this is really something for all veterans. Sure. And that's what our veterans were saying. It's like, wow, I really want to get this message out to the veterans coming home today to not wait 50 years like we did to talk.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's been fun.
So, I think it is probably a little bit easier for today's veteran in that there's a lot more resources available to them. We do see today's veteran doesn't join those legacy veteran service organizations like the American Legion and the VFW like the Vietnam veteran did because that was their safe place to go. Now today's veteran is getting that tribe and that comradeship that they had when they served. They're getting it online on social media platforms, and they're able to get it with the same people that they served with. So things are different for today's veteran, but in the end, I think it's all about the outlet and being able to talk about the experience is huge. What were some of the reasons why these veterans hadn't talked about their experiences before?
It is very layered. I mean, there's a lot of layers. I remember when I was in grade school, we had a teacher who was a Vietnam veteran, and he really wanted to come talk to classes and talk about it. But I remember other teachers saying, oh, be careful. Don't talk to him about it. He has shell shock and, battle fatigue and it will just send him right back. And so we were told not to talk to him. In hindsight, that's literally the worst advice we could have been given. Like he really wanted to talk and it would have been great. But there was just there wasn't that understanding of, shell shock, battle fatigue, now referred to as PTS. And also, in the Vietnam War, it wasn't like today a unit will go over together and they'll come back together. Back then, they did just in-unit replacement. The thinking being we'll always have a trained person leading, but it also meant you always had people you were having to train in to the job constantly, but it also meant they got sent home alone. Today's Dwayne's day to go home. He goes home. Everyone else stays. There was no social media. There wasn't cell phones. They just came home.
Right. No reintegration, really.
And they were back to work the next day.
Yeah.
And also, and they talk of the Army, they felt like it was, you look okay to us, you're on your way. Whereas today there is a much better understanding of, is it perfect? No, but there's a better understanding of the aftercare that needs to be given to veterans. And frankly, a couple of our guys were spit on when they got back at the airport, and that didn't make them want to talk.
Right. Yeah. No, they came home to just a tremendous amount of hostility. It's very much different than the experience of today's veteran and the veterans of the Iraq, Afghanistan war, for sure. I'm curious.
And another thing that Dr. Clymer brought up is, for a veteran, the feeling is, I went to war so my family doesn't have to, so I can shield my family from this. And so the last thing they want to do is come home and say, hey, let me tell you about all the horrible things I went and did so you don't have to experience it. And that can create a gulf to the feeling that I have to hide it. But really, and then when you get into a marriage and you have something that can't be talked about, it can really lead to a gulf in the marriage. And that's something universal on up through today that need to talk.
Yeah. So I'm curious as to how many of the veterans that you spoke with received treatment from the VA today.
It has varied. One of our veterans, Dwayne Blower, talked about how he went to the VA, and they said, and it's in the movie, they said, well, as long as you're here, we would like to test you for Agent Orange.
Yeah.
And Dwayne said, okay, what are the symptoms? And they said, well, we don't know what they are, but we'll have it down on paper that you don't have it. And Dwayne said, well, that sounds like a really good deal. So he said he left the VA and didn't go back for 40 years.
Sure.
But I'd say almost 100% of them now do interact with the VA, whether it be for medical care, or some of them are in veteran support groups where they talk. Veterans from all different conflicts can get together and talk. So they may not have had a lot of interaction in the years after the war, but now I think I can't say with certainty, but almost all of them do interact with the VA.
How long has the movie been out?
We just had our world premiere at the Dances with Films festival down in Hollywood on July 2nd.
Nice.
So that was our first public showing, which was an awesome experience. We had 7 of our veterans and their family who were able to make it.
Nice.
Getty Images was there taking pictures of them on the red carpet for the festival. So that was just an intensely fun night.
Yeah, they must have been really tripping out. It's not their world. Too,
because I was talking to a couple of the veterans, and Charlie Ochoa, his granddaughters, who are aged 18 and 20, were there, and everything pop culture. That's the exact age. So I was talking to Charlie, and I said, "Oh, by the way, because of this." We're premiering here. We are now eligible for an IMDb page for the movie, which is the Internet Movie Database.
Yeah.
You can go look up at Star and see every movie they've been in. I was like, so you guys now have your own IMDb page.
Wow.
And Charlie's granddaughters had just looked like, oh my God, that's so cool. And Charlie looked at me, he's like, what's that? And for that, it's like, well, it's this thing. Never mind. It's cool.
Yeah. You don't need to see it.
Yeah.
Wow. That's just great.
So now
for them.
with the premiere. Yeah. And so that was our premiere. And so now we are working on leveraging that into distribution, hopefully on a streaming service. The actors strike, the writers strike. The current state of streaming is I wish I had more answers.
Right.
But we just kind of got to play it out.
Well, maybe it'll help in the sense that they may be desperate for content.
Yeah, I was talking to one of my mentors just the other day, and I said, well, the longer this goes on, I think I should just title my emails I hear you are in need of movies without writers or actors.
That's right. Is there any? What's the next project? What do you have lined up?
We have spent a long time on this project, and we do have a lot of our screenplays that we're really excited to kind of to talk about once we can talk about them again when the strike is over.
Sure.
It's a lot of times when you make a movie, like if you make a scripted movie, it acts as a calling card and you have your next project and you kind of move on to that. But we feel such a responsibility on this that we are just really focused on getting this movie out onto a platform just for the veterans to be able to have that. But at the same time, we have our screenplays that we're excited to talk about. I guess we're really just excited to talk with managers right now about where we're going to go. And we do. Our biggest hope is to actually also take this from documentary to a live action series. We joke that it could be the Vietnam Band of Brothers very easily. I don't know if it'll be that scale because that was pretty expensive, but there is what these gentlemen did was extraordinary. And I mean, they were a quick reaction force that was in combat 4 or 5 times a week for the year that they were there. Yeah. They downed helicopters, rescue missions. It's amazing stories that really deserve to be told as much as we can tell them. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that strikes me, looking at the still photos that you got from the veterans, actually, is how young they were. I'm looking at a picture here of Dwayne Bloor, and he's wrapped in, looks like 4 or 5 M60 machine gun belts. Yep. And he looks like he's
probably 20 in that picture.
He looks like he's 14.
He's baby faced. He turned 21 over in Vietnam.
Oh my goodness.
I think Doc Del Valle, the medic of the unit, was 19.
Wow.
Jim Brown, they called him the old man because he was 21. And that's what struck. We did have a screening a while ago at the Museum of Flight. People refer to it as the Boeing Museum of Flight. It's right next to Boeing, but it is its own entity. And I have twin daughters, and they were, I think, 14 at the time. And at the end, we're doing audience questions, and one audience member was saying, "I can't believe you have children here. Some of these stories are very hard to hear." And I said, well, they're my children, so they watch me edit the movie. I don't think I could keep them from a screening, but I didn't say it then, but I was thinking, I was like, they're 14. They are the closest in age of anyone in this room to the age these guys were when they were sent to war. Like, I'm in my 40s. I'm very far removed. We will like to think that soldiers are in their 30s, 40s, but no, I mean, in Vietnam, they were 19, 20, 21, flying helicopters and very complex situations.
Yeah.
Soldiers are young.
Where you've screened this, has there been, what percentage of the audience has been veterans?
I'm trying to, it was hard because when you go up and do your Q&A, it's very dark and there's a lot of lights in your face. But I'd say in Hollywood, we had a very large percentage of veterans in the audience. One of our veterans lives in San Clemente, and so he brought a huge contingent of his friends and family up for it, which was fun. And we're always looking for the Apache troop, which is the unit that we documented, has a reunion coming up in October. And so we're working on, and it's in Killeen, Texas, just outside what was Fort Hood, but now Fort Cavazos.
Right.
We're going to have a screening for the Apache troop veterans there, but I'm going to talk to General Funk, who is one of the people in our movie, that he used to be the commanding general of Fort Hood, and his son after him, later on after him. But I want to see if we can just get some veterans from Fort Cavazos to be able to come out and see it as well, and just have that interaction of the Vietnam veterans and the younger veterans to be able to share that. And I think that would be a really cool experience.
Well, I could tell you that our experience with that kind of situation is we do a Thanksgiving dinner the Sunday before Thanksgiving at the Warrior Retreat for about 50 wounded warriors and their families. And we started to invite Vietnam veterans, Korean War veterans. At one point, we had a World War II veteran to have dinner with the warriors. And we weren't sure how it was going to go. But in the end, it was very clear that they all had the same experience. The only difference was the equipment. And they really bonded well, and certainly there's a tremendous amount of respect amongst these younger soldiers for the veterans and what they went through and that kind of thing. So I think it would be wonderful for you to be able to get active duty soldiers out there to see what it was like, because and they themselves will recognize right away, watching this film, about the equipment that they went into battle with and what it's like today and where the casualty rates are. And they're so much lower these days, primarily because of the equipment and the amount of money that the government spends on the military to kind of reduce those casualty numbers. In Vietnam, it was totally different. You had your rifle, you had your ammunition, your hand grenades, and you went out there. And I think that would be great. You know, the other thing that I saw on your webpage that just kind of really blew my mind is there's something called the Apache Troop 19 Reenactment Society. And
yes,
I've never heard of such a thing. I mean, we have reenactment people around where I'm here in Northern Virginia. I'm not far from Manassas Battlefield. So when we say reenactment, we're talking Civil War stuff. I have never seen anything like this for a Vietnam, for other conflicts. What is that like? What's going on there?
That was started by Daryl and Julie Price. We met them through this, now dear friends. Unfortunately, Julie passed away a little while ago from cancer, but Daryl, they started, like you said, as reenactors doing Civil War reenactments, and kind of were like, why does no one do this for Vietnam? And especially being in the South, at Fort Polk, Louisiana, right outside it is the Tigerland Training Ground, where Vietnam veterans, Vietnam soldiers, they're now veterans, but before they were sent to Vietnam, they went and trained there because they found that the wooded environment, but especially the climate and the humidity, was the closest they could find to Vietnam in America.
Right.
So to kind of get them accustomed, a lot of veterans went to Tigerland to train. So they do the reenactments at Tigerland. And so we've been down a couple times, and the last time we went, we actually took a lot of our veterans went with us for the weekend. And the first time we went, we talked to some of the veterans, and they were like, no way are we ever going back to Tigerland. Don't even bring it up. The next year we went, they're like, well, maybe. And then the year later, I got a call from Doc Del Valle saying, hey, a bunch of us are going to Tigerland. Would you like to come? And to see, the coolest moment was when a lot of the reenactors asked our veterans for their autographs because they were Vietnam veterans. And just in that moment where I remember Doc is like, what, you want my autograph? And so I was talking to Daryl. I said, well, why do you do reenactments? And he said, because every year in Mississippi, they have what's called the Trail of Honor, where it's a huge weekend event, but part of it is a trail where you as a civilian can walk down, and it starts at the Revolutionary War on up through modern day. And there'll be a reenactor there who will talk in first person as what it was like, all the gear. And so Daryl said that they come to Louisiana in the middle of summer when it's hot and miserable and dirty and sweaty, because if you're going to go to the Trail of Honor and be able to talk about what it's like to have the sweat dripping down you wearing this huge radio backpack, like you said, we actually have to come do it and experience it. And that's why we do this. And it's like, well, that's pretty cool.
Quite a commitment.
Yeah, it is. It's a huge undertaking, but a really good weekend.
So what did the Apache Troop veterans think about these non-veterans kind of playing their part, wanting to play their part? How did they?
It was the first time we went. Craig Jorgensen was actually with us on the first trip, and where the training ground is actually about a half-hour drive from the closest hotel. So as we're driving out there, Craig was getting quieter and quieter. And as we got closer to the training ground, he was like, maybe we don't need to do this. Like, I don't know if I want to go back to Tigerland. And I was like, hey, we're in the middle of Louisiana in the jungle, in the woods. Let's just go check it out. And as soon as they got in and seeing the trucks from the day and talking to people, but Craig is a published author. He's written several books about his experience, and a lot of the reenactors have read his books because Craig has described the gear, and so they've poured over it, and they were immediately like, oh my God, Craig was a celebrity to them. And it wasn't long before we called it sitting around the campfire. Craig was sitting in a chair, and there was a bunch of reenactors sitting around him like kindergartners at story time, just lapping up every word Craig had to say. And so then we actually went out into the woods with him for some reenactments, and Craig was in the back with me, kind of like, oh, I don't know. And I'd say 100 yards into our walk, Craig walked point in Vietnam, and suddenly he was right back up front, and he was saying, okay, well, we don't want to take the trail because that's where the ambushes are. Follow me. Like, we're going to cut through the jungle, and just immediately back into it and really had a good time. And just being able to impart, he found someone who actually wanted to learn, and he was happy to be able to. And then 2 years later, when we went back with a lot of veterans, it was kind of the same experience driving in. Like, what are we doing here? And when we walked up, the reenactors had set up an honor line to shake all of their hands. And Dwayne Blower, who was an M16 machine gunner, he told us the first time we met him, he's like, I'm never going to fire. He's like, I bow hunt. I never want to fire a gun again after war.
Sure.
Fair point. And so one of the reenactors had an M60, and he was standing there, and everything's with blanks. Dwayne started inching closer and closer, and they're talking. And finally, Dwayne said, so are you going to let me fire that or what? And
wow,
it was a very actually healing experience for him, because his wife was there and he got to share this, and it was a really cool weekend.
Wow. Yeah. What do you think? Do a lot of veterans that see the film feel like they could themselves open up more about their experience?
We do, and this was, since we had focused, our intro into this was Craig, and so he introduced us to his unit. So that's who we were talking to, and by only talking to a very specific unit who served together at a very specific time, instead of telling the grand story of Vietnam, like a history project of, and then General Westmoreland moved people here and this happened, and telling a history story. We're just telling the story of a unit and what they went through. By being so personal, we've talked to other veterans who have said, that could have been me in that chair. Like, I totally relate to what they were saying. And I remember our daughter's godmother, who my wife has known since high school. Her husband was in the Vietnam War, and all currently my wife knew is that he was in the war and he doesn't talk about it. That's what she's known for her entire existence of knowing him. I had sent the trailer to Margie and Bill to watch, and the next day I got an email that was pages long of Bill saying, "I loved your trailer. I want to tell you about my experience."
Mm-hmm.
And I showed it to my wife, and she's just like, he's never talked ever.
Yeah.
And so the next time we went over to their house and the girls were with us, and he's talking to the girls about Vietnam, about being on the helicopters, and just a cool experience. And so I was talking to Michael Barrett, one of our mentors. He's a cinematographer, and I was telling him about the experience, and he said, "How does it feel to know your movie, before it's even released, has had more impact than many blockbusters?"
Mm-hmm.
I was like, "No, that's," and he said, "No, like, you had this positive impact on a person that's quantifiable." And then I kind of was like, "Well, I don't know what to say to that." Like, you're kind of choking me up here. Let's talk about something else, Michael.
Well, it's true. I mean, it's always been a problem. Vietnam veterans didn't get the help they needed. They didn't talk about their experience. They didn't really seek out assistance from the VA. There wasn't that much assistance to be had, and they just kind of melded into society. For the longest time, they didn't even want to talk about being a veteran, because their experience of being a veteran when they came home was hostile. So, there was that continued for years after the war ended, and so, being a veteran really didn't mean that much to them, unfortunately. And they just didn't get the help. They just didn't get the help that they deserved.
In the movie, we talk at the end, and I say, people say, "Leave the world a better place than you found it." And I think too many people think that means you have to go out and cure cancer or do some big grandiose thing. But it's not. You don't have to do a grandiose thing to make the world a better place. We talked to some veterans, not even talked, we listened to some veterans, and they, from just that small act, it had a positive impact on their life. And that is, the world is a better place for that. They're talking to their family. And I'm not saying this to like put this mantle on me, like, but that is the after effect of just sitting down and talking to someone can have a huge effect, and that's not a grand thing.
Yeah,
and it's something we can all do.
Well, and it has an effect not only on the veteran, but like you say, the entire family and their extended family and their coworkers. It just I can't wait to see the movie.
And I can't wait for you to see it.
I've watched the trailer twice. I'll probably watch it again. I've been sending links to folks and telling them to watch this and be ready to watch the full version with me. As we wrap up, I just wanted to say thank you. It's an amazing project, and it's long overdue. But you guys did a really fantastic job. And,
thank you.
Yeah, I can't wait to see it. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And people can find us on Facebook. Follow along as we continue documenting where we'll end up.
Yep. The webpage is ApacheBluesFilm.com. So check out the webpage, look at all the pictures, watch the trailer, and then keep an eye out for where you can see the full-length feature. It's going to be really
hopefully coming soon.
Pretty soon, yeah. Hopefully coming pretty soon. Great.
Yep. As we wait through what's going on in Hollywood right now.
Yeah. Hopefully that will be over soon, and this will be available for everybody to see. So thanks again. I really appreciate it. And for our listeners, thanks for listening. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can send them to us at podcast@willingwarriors.org. And we'll have another episode next Monday at 5 a.m. Until then, thanks for listening.
The Welcome Home podcast is brought to you by Willing Warriors, a nonprofit organization serving active duty service members and veterans since 2012. To learn more, please visit our webpage at willingwarriors.org.